Just a water, please. Thank you. So you wanted to know why I would be studying natural resources, and specifically wildlife management, and and why that's important. And to me, it all boils down to, as an American, you have every right to ownership that to wildlife that I do, that any other American does, that even the president does. And I think that's a very cool aspect of it. And I think that's really why we care and why you should care, is because if you owned like a car or something like that, then you would want to take care of it. So we want to take care of wildlife in the same way. Uh, but if you really wanted to know more about it, Aldo Leopold in his book, A Sand County Almanac, gives possibly the best explanation of why it is so important to manage wildlife. And some of the parts that really stuck out to me is he kind of talks about the history of wildlife management and conservation in general. And then he talks a little bit about human wildlife interactions. And he talks about a little bit of how interconnected everything is. So early in this book, he talks about the cutting down of a oak tree that he has on his property. And he talks about how each ring represents a certain year, because that's how everybody knows that. I think they teach us that in first grade. But he goes further in saying he counts it back. So from today until whenever the tree was planted, each year represents, or each ring represents what happened in that year. And he talks about it is a history of wildlife management and conservation, by saying in this year, this person killed 160 ducks in a day. But the one that stuck out to me the most is he talks about it on actually page 16. And he says that in the year, there was this massive killing of passenger pigeons, which is a reference to the commercial hunting that people used to do in the late 1800s. And passenger pigeons used to be one of the most abundant birds in America. And today, I'm sure you've probably never even heard of a passenger pigeon, but we managed to hunt them to extinction just from killing them to make into pigeon pies, and just because it was cheap meat. And I think that's a really powerful thing to start out the book with, because you kind of understand how important it is, where we've come from, and where we can go with it. And that's really why I wanted to get into the field, is just because I want to help be a part of improving these conditions. And it seems like, from driving animals to extinction, it seems like it's a great way to only go up from here. And then he discusses another section that really stuck out to me, which kind of is an allegory for the taming of the West. And he talks about this bear on Esquidilla Mountain in Arizona there's a grizzly bear, and it would live up on the mountain, and every year it would come down the mountain and kill a cow and eat it, and then it was fine for the rest of the year. It only wanted the one cow. And so after that, it would go back up the mountain. But eventually, the Congress sent a trapper to come out and help tame the West. And he came to the people and said, or asked if there's any dangerous beasts that needed to be slain. And they said, well, yeah, there's this bear. that lives up on the mountain that keeps eating our cattle. And so he goes up into the mountains and he rigs up this contraption where it's a trip line and a rifle. And when the bear crossed the trip line, he triggered the the rifle and shot himself. And he ended up being the last grizzly bear that lived on that mountain. So there's this really poignant example of how the last bear that lived in this region killed himself, which I think is just very, very powerful and feels like it's very interesting how we as people kind of made this symbol of wildlife kill itself. And even worse than that, he did it in July, which I don't know how much you know about pelts, but in summer months, usually animals' pelts aren't very good because they don't need all the fur, they don't need that heavy of a coat. And if you were trapping an animal or killing an animal for its fur, you'd want to do it in the wintertime so you get good value. But he killed this bear in mid-July, so there was really no value at all that could be pulled from this. It's just we kind of took it away, and at the expense of westward expansion and at the expense of civilization. And that, I think, is really important for everybody to remember, because we often have a human-centric view, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But we also need to consider wildlife and natural resources, especially now that cities are growing bigger and people seem to be moving out of rural areas, and forested areas are shrinking. So I think that we just really need to help focus on preserving wildlife, and while also meeting the needs of humanity. And there's going to have to be a compromise in there somewhere, but hopefully wildlife managers can help walk that line and make the right compromises. And then the final thing that really stuck out to me, because this whole book is just great, it's full of great insights on wildlife management, is he's talking about how interconnected everything is. And Leopold grew up as a hunter and always kind of thought that, well, we need to kill more wolves so that the deer populations get bigger so we can hunt more deer. And so he one day is out hunting and ends up killing a wolf and gets down to it just in time. And he describes it as watching the green fire die in its eyes. And he begins to realize that the whole ecosystem is all a finely tuned machine, where the wolves eat the deer, and the deer eat the forage and the plants and everything that they can eat. And as he kind of grew older from that point, he discusses how he's seen places where they've enacted these great wildlife killing or wolf killings, and he's seen mountainsides that are just decimated, deer trails running everywhere, every bush, every plant that's edible has been chewed on. And he really realizes that when we manage wildlife, we have to do it from top to bottom. So we have to consider every layer. We can't just say, well, we want more deer and have it go from there, but really kind of have to go, what habitat do we have? What food do we have for each layer? So what are the plants invasive? Are they edible to the species that live in this? are the prey species surviving enough for the winter to support the predatory species. And I think that's another important reason is our whole ecosystems are in a delicate balance where each section weighs heavily on each section, each other section. And our hope as natural resource managers is just to help make sure that that balance stays right. Well, you said that you had a connecting flight, and I'm getting off here. So I will give you this book, and I'd really recommend that you read it if you're interested in wildlife management. I've read it, and it's possibly one of the most powerful books I've ever read, and it really puts natural resources into perspective. I'd recommend anybody read it, even if people aren't that interested in it. I think it's written in such a way that makes you really understand why natural resources are important. I've just given 3 examples of this, but there's every page, it seems like, has a different lesson that you could take from it. So you can have it, but I'm getting off the flight here. See ya.